Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we are continuing our fantasy football coverage for the 2025 season. We are rolling on with the wide receiver position, and today is our sell list. Now, the reason why we call it the sell list is because every fantasy analyst out there has got to have a way of saying that they like or don't like a player, right? Like you've heard of love, hate. Well, here at Mike's Money Picks, we are doing it with a money theme, so it's buy or sell. These are the wide receivers that I am selling. So these are wide receivers that you do not want to draft. I do not want to end up with these guys on my team. I want to avoid them as much as possible in season-long fantasy leagues, and I'm not willing to take them at their ADP. Granted, if they fall 30 picks, I might invest in them, but these are guys that I'm not willing to draft where they are typically being drafted. Now, if you missed the quarterback episode or both of the running back episodes or the first wide receiver episode, check out the channel feed. They are all there, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel. You're going to want to be there for the final episode, which is going to be the tight ends ranking and tiers episode. And also, once the regular season hits, we're going to have a ton of college football and NFL content coming your way. So make sure you're subscribed so you can be here for all of that. All right. Let's go ahead and dive in. So, on the buy episode for the wide receiver position, we talked about how when it comes to wide receivers, right, you typically know whether or not a wide receiver is good at football by their ability to earn targets within an offense. And sometimes the success of that offense can kind of determine the success of the wide receiver, right? But we also talked about how last season can be a great predictor for this season when it comes to the wide receiver position, because if all things remain unchanged, then it's quite likely that a guy is going to continue to perform at the same level. But sometimes you can look deeper, look within the stats, and find some trends that are alarming and find some guys that are unlikely to repeat what they did last year because of their role within the offense or how they accumulated their fantasy points. So the first guy on my sell list for 2025 is going to be Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. Current ADP wide receiver 26, 59 overall. Consensus ADP, that is from Fantasy Pros. What they do is they look at all of the common fantasy football websites and they kind of get a aggregate ADP from all of those, right? So that's not just ESPN, not just Yahoo, it's all of them. So Zay Flowers being drafted as wide receiver 26 last season, finished as wide receiver 25 overall and wide receiver 32 in fantasy points per game. Okay, so that's not like unfair for where he's being drafted, right? And when you look at his workload last year, he ranked 20th in targets and 18th in target share. So okay, so he's getting a little bit more targets than what he's scoring. Okay, that's still not the end of the world. But when you look at what the Ravens offense did last year, it should have been a Zay Flowers ceiling season, and it wasn't. In 2024, Lamar Jackson set a career high in passing yards by almost 500 yards, and he also passed the ball more than he ever had in his entire career. That's something that the Ravens generally don't do. Like, they really unveiled this new Lamar Unleashed offense, and it was Lamar's best season ever. So it stands to reason that a lot of his pass catchers should have had great years also, right? Not really. Mark Andrews had his worst season since his rookie year. Wide receiver 2, Rashad Bateman, finished as wide receiver 40 overall. And Zay Flowers, in a situation where Andrews was down, Bateman was down, and the whole offense and Lamar was up, only finished as wide receiver 25. I just fail to see a scenario where Andrews and Bateman continue to be as irrelevant as they are, and Flowers can't do better than he did last year. Like, it just seems like last year should have been this huge breakout season for Flowers when you looked at everything that was happening around him, and it wasn't. So for that reason, I just can't feel good about clicking him this year. I just don't have faith that he's going to progress forward in his career, because what if the other guys start playing better? What if Lamar doesn't pass for as much yards as he did last year? Well, then that has to eat into Flowers a slice of the pie, which already is where he's being drafted. The next wide receiver on my sell list is entering a situation that is significantly worse than what he saw in his previous years in his career. It is DK Metcalf, now of the Pittsburgh Steelers. His current ADP is wide receiver 21. He's being drafted at 48th overall consensus ADP. Now, he finished last season as wide receiver 32 in fantasy points per game. Okay, that's not terrible. And on paper, he's going to a team where he's going to have Aaron Rodgers throwing to him, right? Okay, like that should be a decent upgrade for a guy that we know is very talented, one of the, ultimate athletic freaks in NFL history, right? But the situation he's entering is not great at all because of one man. And it's not Aaron Rodgers. If you're a long-term listener to the podcast, you know who this one man is. It's Arthur Smith. Arthur Smith. So Seattle last season, where DK Metcalf was playing, ranked 5th in the NFL in pass rate. They were throwing the ball over the yard, and Metcalf still only finished as wide receiver 32 in fantasy points per game. Pittsburgh, coached by Arthur Smith, finished 5th in rush rate. So what that means is that the team that DK Metcalf left had significantly more pass attempts than the team that DK Metcalf is going to, right? And so automatically the volume is going to be down. That automatically significantly lessens the likelihood that he's going to reach where he was in his previous years as in terms of his fantasy production, right? And add that to the fact that Arthur Smith, because he's so incompetent, his best fantasy wide receiver when he's been a head coach or an offensive coordinator is wide receiver 31 in fantasy points per game. This is a man who coached A.J. Brown and Drake London. Like, wide receiver 31's the best you can do? Arthur Smith. Like, I just have no faith that I can draft a player that's going to be coached by Arthur Smith in this scheme for the Pittsburgh Steelers, right? Now, if the argument is, well, wait a minute, Mike, what if Aaron Rodgers elevates the offense, and we know Aaron Rodgers loves to feed one receiver? What if that receiver is Metcalf? Well, if you think back to the past receivers that Aaron Rodgers has really fed, I'm talking Devontae Adams, I'm talking Randall Cobb, I'm talking Jordy Nelson at the earlier part of his career. Those are guys who run a deep route tree and can get open on slants and ins and digs and just run a versatile route tree, right? DK Metcalf is just a go ball guy. Like, that doesn't really fit with what Aaron Rodgers' game is in the 2025 season. And add that to the fact that DK Metcalf's skills at running that go route have kind of been deteriorating. He hasn't finished as a top 20 wide receiver since 2020, and that was the only time he did so in his career. So what evidence do we have that this guy, heading to an offense that doesn't really fit him, coached by Arthur Smith, is going to finish in the top 20 for the first time in 6 years, and he's being drafted right outside the top 20? I just don't think that's a good value. I just don't think that's a good bet. I'm out on DK Metcalf in 2025. Now, the next wide receiver on my sell list, I don't even know if I can call him a wide receiver. It's Travis Hunter. Current ADP wide receiver 31, that is 69th overall. Yeah. Obviously, there's a lot to like about Travis Hunter, right? Like, I am a personal fan of Travis Hunter. I think it's really cool that he is playing both ways. You know, could be the first NFL player to play full-time both ways since Chuck Bednarik back in 1960, the Philadelphia Eagles. I'm just a football nerd, so I know that kind of thing. And I was a fan of his when he was at Colorado. Like, I just think he's a good kid. I think, you know, as a guy who used to coach high school football, he's the type of kid I would want to coach, the type of guy I would want to be around. Just seems like a good guy. Consider me a fan, right? Not in fantasy because of the situation that he finds himself in and the situation that you have to draft him in for fantasy. Like, you have to draft him around a top 30 wide receiver, and he's being drafted to a team in the Jaguars that already has a bona fide wide receiver one in Brian Thomas Jr. They signed De'Ami Brown of the Washington Commanders in free agency to be their new slot. And so when you start doing the math, last season, the Jaguars wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3, which is Gabe Davis and Christian Kirk, who are not bad NFL players by any stretch of the means, they combined for 14.4 fantasy points per game last season. That mark would have ranked as wide receiver 20 in fantasy points per game. So if you added up the 2 tertiary targets for this Jaguars offense, that's wide receiver 20. And you're telling me that Travis Hunter is going to take all of that when there's also De'Ami Brown over there? I just don't really see that happening. I think that this is, you know, as much as we love a prospect, this is a bad situation to be drafted into as the Jaguars wide receiver 2, with the fact that they already have a bona fide alpha in Brian Thomas Jr. I just don't think that that's a good spot. Like, if the name Travis Hunter were not attached to Jaguars wide receiver 2, you would not want him. Just honestly. So I just don't think that's a great situation for him. And then add that to the fact that we already mentioned, no NFL player has played both ways full-time since 1960. So he's doing something that is unprecedented. I fail to see a scenario where he plays all of the snaps offensively for Jacksonville, because, like, that's just impossible. Like, if you look at what he did at Colorado, yes, he played almost every single snap, but Colorado also very much sheltered him. They were running drag routes, screen routes, hitch routes. You know, they weren't throwing him go balls or post routes or corner routes that would involve a lot of running downfield and then jogging back to the line of scrimmage. They were very much conserving him by his route tree, and I don't think you can really do that in the NFL. and play a full game, or, have a team not just annihilate that strategically, that, this guy's not running deep. And so I think that that's a bad fit for fantasy also, because if he's not running those routes, then those routes are where you score a lot of fantasy points, if you're running deep. So I just don't think that that's a good spot to draft a guy in fantasy football. And then also add that to the fact that I think Travis Hunter was a better corner than wide receiver. So if he plays more snaps at corner than wide receiver, what does that do to his fantasy value? If the Jaguars have an injury to one of their cornerbacks and he has to now play 100% of the snaps on defense, what does that do to his fantasy value? Because he can't play 100% of the snaps offensively. Yeah, I get it. I know he's a great athlete. I know he's a unicorn, but at some point, we just got to ask ourselves, does this make sense for fantasy football? And as much as I like Travis Hunter as a real life player, real life athlete, it doesn't make sense to draft him in fantasy football, considering he's more likely to play actual cornerback than wide receiver here in his rookie season. All right, the last wide receiver on the sell list in 2025 is a guy who had one of the best seasons of a fantasy wide receiver of all time, but now is on the downturn of his career and is in a different locale. That is Cooper Kupp, now of the Seattle Seahawks. His current ADP is wide receiver 40. That is 85th overall. So when you look at Cooper Kupp, yes, he's been great in his career, right? But he was hugely dependent on high volume to produce strong finishes. And so what I mean by that is Cooper Kupp is a guy that when he, scored a lot of fantasy points, it wasn't because he was just doing a Deshaun Jackson 1 catch, 80 yards, 1 touchdown, right? He was dependent on getting you a lot of catches for not necessarily a whole lot of yards, but a decent amount of touchdowns at the end of the day, right? Even in 2024, which was a somewhat down year for Kupp, he ranked 16th in the league in target share, 5th in target rate, and ended as the 19th best wide receiver in fantasy points per game. That's a lot of volume, right? And even then, he only played 12 games. He finished wide receiver 38 overall. He hasn't played in more than 12 games since his magical 2021 season. So what you would need for Cooper Kupp to give you a good return on your number is you would need him to stay healthy, which he hasn't done. And you would need him to see a ton of volume in this Seattle Seahawks offense, which I'm not sure he's going to do, given that he's got Jackson Smith and Jigba. If you want to know how I feel about Jackson Smith and Jigba, go watch the other wide receiver episode. So I just think this is a horrible spot for Cooper Kupp. I think everybody is drafting him based off of name recognition. If I had $1 for every time in fantasy football guys have been drafted long past their prime solely because of name recognition, it'd be quite a few dollars. I could probably go buy myself a steak dinner. So don't be that guy this year. Don't buy into Cooper Kupp. He is on the wide receiver sell list for me in 2025. Now, that is going to do it here for this episode, y'all. Those are 4 receivers that I am not drafting in 2025. Now, if you want to check out the tight end episode, make sure you're subscribed if you're watching on YouTube. That way you can be with us here for that episode, as well as all of our NFL and college football content throughout the regular season. If you're watching on YouTube, you can hit that like button. It'll help me out a ton. And if you're listening on audio, you can rate and review. Again, I cannot stress enough how much it helps me out when you guys do that, and I really do appreciate it. And guys know that if you want access to the rankings and the best ball tools, as well as the DFS core plays once the regular season starts, head on over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks. All right, that is going to do it here for this episode, y'all. And that's going to do it for the wide receiver position. We've got one left, which is a position that I have a little soft spot for because I played that position in high school. That is tight end. So make sure you're around for that. But like I said, the whole point of this is to help you guys in your season-long fantasy drafts. Draft the right guys. So don't draft these guys we've just been talking about here on this episode. Draft the right guys. And hopefully we're going to help you guys win your fantasy leagues this year. But that is going to do it for this episode, y'all. Hopefully we're able to give you guys some good information that you can use to help kill your fantasy drafts this year. Thank you guys for watching and listening to this point, and I will see you guys next time.